and welcome to Building Your Brand, Bridging the Gap Between Data and Emotions. Today we've got an exciting panel discussion with experts in data and branding. My name is Alessandra Guybin and I'm the Marketing Manager at GreenRope. Now let's get to our panelists. I'd like to welcome Chris Foster, Lars Helgeson, and Fabien Gare. All right, and now before I get to the panelists, I'd like to give a brief bio. So Lars started in the internet marketing space in 2000 when he co-founded one of the world's first email service providers, Cooler Email. In 2010, after spending several years designing and implementing a more comprehensive way to meet the needs of small and mid-sized businesses, he launched GreenRope, a cloud-based platform that simplifies and consolidates a company's sales, marketing, and operations. GreenRope currently provides technology solutions to over 3,000 companies worldwide. In 2017, he wrote and published CRM for Dummies, and his favorite CRM-related mantra is, if it isn't in the CRM, it didn't happen. And believe me, he stays true to that.
That is true. You have to live that.
And our next panelist is Fabien Gare, renowned brand strategist and creative director. He's a prolific author and speaker on the subject of branding. He is also the founder and principal of Los Angeles-based brand consultancy, Fabien. You'll have to correct me on that. He's also a columnist for Forbes and Inc. and has been published by the likes of the Washington Post, Entrepreneur, and Mashable. He also has a best-selling book, How to Launch a Brand, and became a go-to resource for entrepreneurs and creatives alike. We're really, really lucky to have you here, so welcome.
Thank you.
And our final panelist, Mr. Chris Foster, welcome. He has been involved in marketing and business model development for more than 20 years. With experience in strategy, customer research, data analytics, branding, messaging, demand generation, product development, creation direction, and business model creation, Chris is constantly engaged with the practice and study of how audience markets and businesses develop. You do a lot of things.
It's true. Been lucky in that respect.
In addition to working in the field, he also has been teaching product management and branding at UCSD Extension for 8 years. So welcome. This is obviously an incredible panel of brand experts and data experts. And before we get started on some of our questions here, I'd like for you each to say hello to our audience and give a brief, give your own brief introduction. So Fabien, why don't we start with you?
Well, hello. There's not much to say. I had such a long bio that you read there. It was beautiful. I guess the brand consultancy is called Fabien, and that's the only thing I can add to it. We really create strategic, verbal, and visual brand clarity. So I work a lot with companies that have a big opportunity in front of them, and they know they need a brand that is actually big enough to fit their aspirations and goals. So those are typically corporations that are either relaunching or launching spin-off startup brands. And I come in, work on strategy, name, identity, and such, and often just consult.
Chris.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. Welcome to this. I appreciate being a part of it. I love helping businesses discover their voice and their brand, specifically for small business and mid-market companies. When I teach at UCSD Extension, a lot of my students actually have their own business and they're looking to kind of get started. Usually it's a small business or the like. My role here at Modern Postcard is also to create new products, services, and to help small mid-market businesses market themselves better. So I'm thrilled at the chance to kind of talk about what I've learned over the course of years and see if Fabien and Lars and I can help you guys out.
And Lars.
Yeah, well, thank you. First, thank you both, Fabien and Chris, for being here. It's so great, such an honor to be on a panel with you guys, with your experience and knowledge that you have. We started GreenRope as a comprehensive CRM platform, and as we started getting into it and working with the various different companies of all different sizes in all parts of the world, we started finding that there were some common themes of challenges that they face. And a lot of them have to do with what we're going to talk about today, understanding what a brand is and how to really leverage that when it comes to actually managing your own brand inside the context of a CRM. What we have found is a lot of CRMs have a human problem in front of them, understanding what exactly are we trying to solve? How are we going to do it? And it's not just software. It's a bigger problem than that. And that's why I think this panel is going to shine the light on a lot of things that are not necessarily, how do you set up your CRM? How do you manage your email? How do you train your salespeople? Things like that. This is a bigger, more strategic decision that when people talk about working on your business as opposed to working in your business, when you take that step back and you look at the strategy, you see the impact of these kinds of thoughts, these kinds of strategic discussions that you will have with your team, and how they can really guide your business to grow in a direction that makes a lot of sense, that will be effective, and really communicates your brand effectively to your market.
Thank you. And thank you all again for joining us on this panel. I know that everyone listening in and everyone who will be receiving this webinar afterwards will really get a lot out of it. And I think it's time to get started with some questions. And so for everyone watching, you can see the questions on the screen. These are our topics for today. You will also be receiving this slide deck. You will have not only access to on how to connect with our panelists, but as well as some resources that they've provided that can offer you some advice and tips for building your own brand. And so we will be sending that out with the recording to everyone who registered for this webinar today. All right, so let's start out with our first question. So what does branding really encompass? How do you find the right voice? And Fabien, why don't you start us off with that?
Happy to do so. It's a big question. What does branding encompass? It's really all encompassing branding, right? So to me, branding is infusing heart and soul into your business, because if you don't have heart, you will always compete on price, right? So you have to infuse heart and soul and then showcase it through attractive and consistent design as well as smart usability. So with that being said, branding is all-encompassing, which does not help many that wonder, like, well, how do I start with branding? But it shows you that the journey needs to be authentic and extremely intrinsic. And to get there, the question about finding the right brand voice for your brand specifically, you have to define the brand personality first. So you have to define, as a brand, what is my personality, right? So how should you act and react, especially with social media, right? Like, how should a brand react, and how should you speak, and how does your customer actually want to be talked to? I do these 1-day brand strategy intensives, and I call it intensive because it's like 8 hours, and my clients afterwards are completely at the end. They're completely exhausted. But I do these intensive, and one of those exercises goes into the brand personality, and we use something that is called the brand personality wheel. And in the white paper that you mentioned in the intro that everyone can get after this call, I actually have that exercise in there. So it's really the idea that there are different brand personalities, and your business has to define which one it actually is. So for instance, there's the friend personality, or the mother, or the rebel, and this is very stereotypical and it's a little esoteric, right? But you have to cling on to that. So when you think about Target, for instance, the big box retailer, they're straightforward, they're sociable, they're a friend, right? It's a friend personality. That's how they need to talk. That's how they need to walk. If you think about Mother, that's Dove, like the skincare line soaps, right? They're generous, they're caring, and so on and so forth, right? Rebel is Red Bull. The Dreamer brand is Apple, or maybe it used to be Apple. It's debatable. I'm sure Chris, Lars, and I could go off on that. But the idea is that if you do this exercise, you don't just pick the personality you want to have. You don't just say, I'm the dreamer, or I'm the seductress. And it's like, no, you're not. What is your brand, right? So you come up with keywords that describe or not describe your brand. So you basically say, and I've got a whole list in this white paper. It's like, are you relaxed as a brand? Are you innovative as a brand? Are you strong as a brand? Are you quiet, et cetera, et cetera? And you only check off the ones that your brand actually is, right? And in the end, you associate these keywords with the personality, right? So what happens with that, so in the end, if you realize, okay, we are actually a friend brand, like first and foremost, our brand is a friend, then you can actually go further and say, what does it mean to the brand? Well, we can say things in a fun way, but never childish, right? We can be clever, but not silly, right? And so that's how you can slowly define a verbal guide, and that can become kind of like a platform for all of your communications. And you can even define it by categories. So you can think about, well, our brand is on Instagram, but we also have white papers. Well, maybe for white papers, you have different types of readers that have different types of feelings. They have different types of pain points. So then Instagram followers, right? So the tone of voice of your brand can actually be adjusted by the type. But in the end, it always has to go back to that main personality. And I feel like that is something that really helps my clients to understand that, oh, as a brand, we are a leader. So let's be bold. Let's go top down and tell people how things need to happen, right? If we're the leadership brand. So that's just a trick that I usually use to define that.
I like that.
That's great.
I like that. That's interesting. And Chris, I know that you've got something that you'd like to add to that as well.
Sure. No, I think that was a perfect way to go. And I really liked what Fabien talked about with heart and soul. Businesses oftentimes are seen as a business, but in the end, businesses are people, right? I mean, GreenRope is run by a pickle, or a fire hydrant is run by Lars, right? So I think that the brands that take on the personalities of those founders or the culture of the people. It doesn't matter if your company is 3 people, 5 people, 50 people, 250 people. A culture naturally develops because of the human factor and the like Fabien said, the heart and the soul of the people in the business. So one exercise that I love Fabien's exercise. I think that's great to think about those types and those personas. What I've done with a lot of my students is ask, if your brand walks into a room, what does he or she look like? So it's like, oh, come on in, brand. Ah, here you are, right? And if you think about energy drinks like Red Bull, he said it was a Rebel, or Rockstar or Monster. I guarantee you that if you said, hey, Monster energy drink, come on into a room, that person looks a lot different than the Red Bull person, right? They just look different, right? They're wearing different clothes. They're saying different things. They have different language. So that's a way to understand a little bit about, how does my person look? What we did at Modern Postcard is when I launched the website, we had a chat bot, right? And so, well, who's the chat bot? I said, well, her name is Iris. Iris Group is kind of the parent company. So her name is Iris. She's Iris Bot, and she's smart and clever. So she's got glasses. She looks pretty cool. She's smart, and she has her own voice, and it's Iris, right? So that's kind of how would Modern Postcard look when she walks into a room. So that's an easy exercise that you guys can try too. It's a little bit fun, but when you really start getting into it, since each brand has its own character, like a character in a book or a movie, and you really describe that person, to Fabien's point, you start understanding the language and the voice and kind of how they're sounding, the words that they use, the words that they don't use. So that's another way to start thinking about kind of humanizing your brand.
I love that. What does your brand look like when it walks into a room? I think that's a really good way. And like you said, it's kind of fun to think about, because I don't think that's initially anything that a brand or a company necessarily thinks about when they're talking about their brand. So that's really interesting. And with that, I think let's move to the next question. What are some key ways in finding out about your brand experience? And Lars, I'm going to pass this on to the data side to start with.
Yeah, it's sort of, it's both. Like when Fabien and Chris were talking about brand, and you talk about, like when a brand walks into a room or when you're perceiving a brand, a lot of times that's an emotional type of connection that you're having, or lack of connection if it's not working very well. What we want to look at is, how do we try to quantify that? How do we gather enough data or information that lets us really understand, well, what exactly does that mean? And so, one of the common things that comes out when you talk to people about, well, how do you learn about your customers, is sending surveys. And that's a good way to do it. It's sort of an overt, well, what do you think about us? What do you think about your last experience when you talked to our customer support person? Was your answer resolved in time? And so, surveys are an easy way to reach out, get some data, and look at it. And Net Promoter Score is a big thing. The questions that say, how likely are you to recommend us to someone that you don't know or to someone that you do know? And having that scoring there, the Net Promoter Score. So there are the things you can do that are sort of the overt, asking leads or customers what they actually think about their experience. And then there are other things that you can do that are less overt, that are a little bit more passive. And those are things like looking at the performance of different campaigns that you run and measuring, well, is that campaign resonating with this particular target market? So an example would be, if I'm going to have an advertisement that's targeted towards, say, women on Facebook, does the brand or does the image that we're putting in this advertisement work better or worse than other things that we have done? So when you start segmenting your market and you look at specific things, and maybe you segment further and you say, you go maybe by age range or geographic or interests in certain things, and you try to position advertisements, and then you measure the performance of those advertisements. So looking at more than just how many times did someone click on the ad, but follow them all the way through to conversion, and then do follow-up surveys after they're done. And then you can take a full look at the entire process and see, okay, so we targeted 100,000 people, and maybe they were women in their mid-30s in Southern California, whatever. And then based on that, you can measure how did one ad compare to another ad? Is our brand effectively communicating to that particular demographic? And we measure that. It could be measured in how often do people click on that ad? How often do people get to the next stage? And that's where really understanding what your sales process really, that's where that comes in, because then you can see at what point do people tend to fall off of that sales process. And so what we're trying to do is put into data terms what Chris and Fabien were talking about before, of understanding, is the brand resonating with this target, with your target markets? And the only way to really know if it's resonating is with data. You can have sort of like the qualitative analysis where someone might call in and say, yeah, I really love this. I had a great experience. And some of those qualitative things are very important, where you can get some good insight. But a lot of it has to be driven by data, so that you can say, of this population, what percentage got to which stage of the conversion process? And then of them, what was their experience like? Was it generally positive, generally negative? What percentage of people loved it versus hated it? So then you can you can really look at your brand and see how well it's being received. And so again, the better we can turn this into data, then it makes it easier for us as business owners to make data-driven decisions, and not decisions based on just a couple of empirical stories that we might hear. An example with that would be, maybe you have an ad that particularly resonates with two people in a very large audience, and they are the ones that are so excited that they call, and somehow those stories get shared around your company, and you think that, wow, this is such a great story. We had two super happy people that became customer advocates, and then the data doesn't necessarily back it up, because you don't have enough data for that to be significant. And that's what we want to do. We want to get past those empirical stories, not to say they're not important, but we have to really balance that out with data, so that we know the difference between the emotional story that we hear that says, wow, these people were really happy with us, with the overall story of saying, well, how many people, as a result of what we sent out, actually converted, actually had a great experience, actually responded to the message.
That's great. No, I love that. And I think to tack on with those surveys are actually really easy to deploy. The harder part about the survey is what to ask, but pretty much they're going to be free. And especially if you've got clients and leads that are engaging with you, not all of them, but a lot of folks are willing to pitch in and give their feedback. And to Lars's point about segmentation, by understanding which part of the sales and marketing funnel that your folks are going through, you can excise those folks practically and say, okay, I've got 150 people that are in this stage of my lead funnel and they're kind of stuck here and they're not moving. Or these are the people who purchased that went through this funnel. Reaching back out to them with questions about how they would describe your brand or describe your experience is actually an easy way to get some feedback from them, especially if it's drop down of words or word choices that they can use. You know, because Fabien had mentioned what are kind of words that describe and words that don't describe. You can actually take that concept, marry it with the survey and put it together and send it out to various folks on different data sets within your CRM. And so, and the good exercise is, you know, use the, you know, pick the words that describe your experience. And also you can do that internally, right? If you do that same survey to all of the folks who work in your business and say, you know, choose the words that describe our brand and then try to match that up with your customers. If it aligns, that's perfect. And there's good resonance between how you see yourself and how your customers see yourself. If it's misaligned, then you know that too. And you know kind of how you think, oh, well, we offer a fantastic experience and our customers love us. And then you get the data back from your customers and it doesn't quite jive. That's where you know you're misconnecting from a brand experience. So that's an exercise that you can also try.
Yeah.
And I think the only thing that I want to add, especially to Lars's point, data is so important to really figure out what you're doing and what people think about it and what your customers are doing and who your audience is. But there's also this big element of founders and their gut instinct. And I don't want to underplay that, right? So I'm doing a podcast now called Hitting the Mark, and I ask founders, I always make sure that's one question that I ask founders. I'm like, and they're you know, like successful founders, they already made it. And I asked them, was there ever a time in your history of the company where you went against all data, like everything that your data said, and you went against the grain and just based on your gut instinct, you created a feature or you changed your voice. So you did something where you just felt like, I need to do this because I think this is right for the company. And every single one of them has a story. Every single one of them is like, yeah, there was this one time, like we had this, let's say 30-year, you know, mid-30s women in Southern California. All of them said they needed a feature to do ABC. And we're like, no, you actually need a feature to do, you know, DEF, right? Whatever. And they did that against everyone's will, and then it's the same thing with that quote that I don't know. It was dubiously attributed to Henry Ford. I don't know if it actually was. How would we? But he supposedly said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, right? And I think that right now, today, where it's so much is about data, and again, I think it is so important. It's crucial to actually use your data. There's also if you want to innovate, right? If it's not about marketing or reviewing how campaigns are working, but if you actually want to go against the norm, when you think past what has been felt, right, and what has been said, that's not how you're going to get into the future. So it's always this like little thing, like, you know, always be critical with the data that you get versus what you actually wanted to get out of it.
Absolutely true. I remember when I started GreenRope, I gave a presentation back in 2010 to a room full of professionals, and it was a thing where you kind of stand up, you talk about a business problem, and people say, well, are you going to do it or not? And you know, what are the challenges? What are your recommendations? And every single person in that room said, you should not try to do what you're trying to do. I mean, 200 people, including venture capitalists.
Perfect example.
Yeah, because they all said it's too hard. You'll never be able to do it. You know, and I kind of use that as fuel for me. But
yeah,
but it's a perfect example of if I had listened to everyone in that room, the data that I had gathered, at least in that room, said that the industry, the world was not ready for a technology like what we have on GreenRope, which we already built and obviously was successful. So, you know, that there's a perfect example of that.
It is a good story. One of the great stories too on that point was the guy who founded Salesforce. Everybody's familiar with Salesforce, different competing thing, but their big thing was the logo of no software, right? And it was, oh, you can't do that, it's negative. But he did it. And I think that, you know, especially if you own your business or you're the GM of a mid-market, I love Fabien and Lars's example to trust your gut because it got you to a place. And the data, I think, and what I've learned over X number of decades is data is directional. It's not definitive. Data directs you and guides you and helps you kind of turn that data. The data helps you take it and turn it into information and give you insight into how to run the business. But it doesn't have to be mandatory to follow the data. It gives you insight, gives you better insight than you could get from talking to 100 people, rapidly. But like to Fabien's point, there's a balance of using that insight to say, oh, I see, I trust this, but I also trust my own vision too. So you'll find examples where your own vision either might be complementary to the data or contradictory to the data. And at that point, then there's either you trust yourself and you move forward, or you make some modifications where is the data, directing you in a certain way, and following that example.
Yeah, and I think that's really true just in in part of branding is in your marketing as well, is I think that you get a lot of data, but you can kind of use that as a guide to come up with other creative things that may, stimulate that same audience in a different way, but using the data that you do have to kind of, inspire what, and guide that other creative vision that you have. Great. So that was really insightful. I love that. And so that, I think, really brings us to our next question quite well, is when it comes to building a brand, what are the key data points that you should be using? And I know that you all are going to have something really insightful to say on this because, obviously there's a lot of different angles here. And so who would like to give this one a start?
Well, I think that where I would go with it as you're building it is understanding, to Fabien's point, kind of who your customers are, right? So the data points of your customers, they're not just going to be names. There's going to be some, when you look under the hood, if you're a B2C company, it's pretty easy, straightforward to actually take a look at your customer base. If you have a couple hundred people, and you can get what's called a customer profile. And that profile lets you know what the demographics are, the attributes of the business, or the attributes of the customers, whether kids or no kids, income ranges and the like. And there are businesses that do that, where it's called a customer profile report. And it helps you kind of figure out a little bit some of those key aspects. Are my customers skewing more female or male? Are they skewing of a certain age group? And what I like to do is kind of look at the bell curve, right? What is the bell curve, the middle of the bell curve? Who's most of our customers looking like? If you're a B2B brand, clearly, the data point showing, the employee sizes, the revenue, clearly the industry and the like. And those are ways in which, as you're building the brand, you're building it for an audience. Of course, you have a product and service that you're making, but you want to connect with an audience that's going to believe in what you believe. And so opening up getting under the hood of just some very simple demographics of the customer base that you have is a great way to start, figuring out who you want to get to believe what you believe.
And before we move over to, because I'm really excited to kind of hear the difference in, obviously, Chris, you come from, more of the storytelling, emotional side, and now I'd love to hear what Fabien says, and then I'd love to finish it off with the technical, more data-driven side from Lars, because I think that will kind of finish that off nicely, this topic off nicely.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that. I mean, I totally agree with Chris. Right? It's all about the person that actually purchases your brand in one way or the other. Right? So I always tell entrepreneurs, it's not about you, it's about them. Right? So who are these people? And let's try to look from the outside in. Right? Super important. But it goes back to the question why. Right? Like why would they care deeply about your product or service as a brand, right? Like why would they fall in love with it? And that's usually about a pain point. And it could be an emotional pain point. It could be an actual, like physical problem. It could be, it could be a lot of different things, right? It's features, feature benefits versus emotional benefits. And really figuring out what those key points are. And that's data can help tremendously, right? Like out of a group of 100 people, who has these problems, or how do they feel emotionally about, you know, a competitive brand? And, oh, well, they all feel this way. Maybe we can come in a totally different way. So that's when data gets really exciting in brand building.
Lars, I know that, you know, coming from, you know, CRM marketing automation, you'll have a lot of insight in this as well from the data-driven side.
Yeah, it's, you know, it's not, fundamentally it's the same. It's just a different way of how do you take the high level and apply it to the way you're actually going to use these strategies and tactics. And it starts with, there's always three main phases that I talk about. One is understanding our market segments. Two is understanding the process. And three is building a data model around that. So when we look at our market segments, we go back to the example we were talking about before. If you're going to be sending different ads to, say, people of different genders or different ages or different geographic regions, you're going to have to know that information. So you're going to have to store that in your CRM. So you'll have to figure out, what do you need to do to be able to effectively segment your market? Who are you selling to? And store that data inside of your CRM. The next part of that is looking at the process, understanding how someone goes through what we call the customer journey. The customer journey starts with when they first see an ad, brings them to maybe going to your website, maybe having a conversation or a phone call, maybe seeing you at a trade show, going through different things, and maybe going to your website, then maybe filling out a form or requesting information, or going to your online store, maybe going to a physical storefront, mapping how someone goes through that entire process until they pay you. At that point, you're not done though. You still want to make sure that you're engaging with someone after they purchase from you to turn them into a customer advocate, a brand advocate, someone who says, I really loved my experience and I want to tell other people about my experience with your company. So you create a map. And so we have a free tool called journeyflow.com, little shameless self-promotion, but it's free. So all you need is LinkedIn to log in and do it. But
awesome.
Yeah, but it's but journeyflow.com, and we have an app too. It's the way it works is it's a drag and drop thing that lets you visualize what this process looks like, what the customer journey looks like. So someone goes to, maybe you meet them at a trade show, or maybe you meet them at a coffee shop, and you tell them, maybe you give them a business card and you want to drive them to a particular landing page or to your website. Then what do you want them to do? And so thinking through that whole process and mapping it out visually so that you can see, well, there are going to be some diverging points. So at some point you're going to say, well, I'm going to treat somebody differently if they're interested in product X versus service Y. I'm going to treat somebody differently if they fall in this particular demographic. Maybe if someone is, maybe they work for a certain type of company, a certain size of company, or in a certain industry, you're going to treat them a little bit differently. And that's where we need to look at each of those places where we personalize the whole experience there and say, we need to know that. So if we are going to treat someone differently depending on what industry they're in, say, for example, you're going to treat someone differently if they're in construction versus if they're in real estate. They're going to have very different motivating factors into what makes them become a customer. So you're going to want to figure out then, what do we need to know about these people? Do we need to know more than just what their industry is? If we are looking at construction, do we care, or real estate, do we care about if they're in retail versus commercial versus multi-tenant? You know, all these different questions that you might need to ask to help you personalize what this brand experience is going to be for someone as they interact with you. And once you're able to get all of that dialed in, you want to make sure you set up your CRM, because the CRM is the core of all of this. The CRM is storing all this data. You want to make sure you have all the fields and objects set up so that you can actually gather that data. Now, some of it may not be readily evident. You may not want to ask someone all the details the first time you contact them, or the first time they contact you on their first contact form. You may just want to have, I just want to know your name and your email address, or maybe just your name or just your phone number, whatever. You want to gather the minimum amount of information. Use services like data appending services, which again, we have this built in for free inside of GreenRope. But the idea of being able to leverage data that you know about someone and append automatically additional data. So being able to see what their interests are, seeing what their Facebook page URL is, how many Twitter followers do they have, all of that. Being able to pull that directly into your CRM automatically so that you can then use that data to gather what you need to be able to personalize your experience with the brand with them. And some of it could be automated, some of it's going to be provided by them. And some of it may be something that you ask from them later on down the path of getting to know them better. In all cases, you have to have a map of how all of that works to be able to effectively target your brand to the right kind of people. So that's what we want to create, is we want to take the story that we want to tell, understand how it relates to every single market segment, and then look at how those different segments are going to react in their customer journeys and make sure that we have everything covered from the start to the finish. And then that will give us the tools that we need to be effectively communicating with them.
That's great. And the one thing that, to reiterate what Lars says, it doesn't have to be all at once. It can be built gradually. So a lesson from a guy named Harvey Mackay. He was in one of the sexiest industries possible. He sold envelopes. And so that's what he did. He sell envelopes. But he had Harvey Mackay's 66. And this was where he said, you build over time 66 pieces of information about your customers: the birth dates, the kids, the name of the kids, the birthdays of the kids. Maybe there's pets, maybe there's a favorite vacation. But it doesn't have to be that in depth. But to Lars's point, the more that you know about the user and the more information that you can build over time in your CRM system, the more personalized the messages can be when you engage with them. And as human beings, we want personal messages, right? If someone sends me an email that says, hey, the water temperature is now 64 degrees, I'm sure it's a lot warmer when you go swimming, I'm like, I'm going to read your email, right? Because you know a little bit about me and what I do. So those are the types of things where, the properly built CRM and the journey map can build over time, knowing a whole lot about your customers and then segmenting the communications that way.
Yeah, one thing, and I think that both of what you said is really interesting. And Lars, I love that you brought up, that customer journey mapping and the segmentation. But at the same time, even though you segment your market and you give them a different experience, you still want your brand messaging to be consistent, right? So what is some advice, and I want to hear from all of you on this, for developing a consistent brand message or a consistent presence across all of your channels and throughout that customer journey, even through segmentation and personalization?
Well, I can take this one as a start. I mean, the idea, since we defined now who the users are, we defined, like why people should care about it. We defined what the personality and the voice should be. I think the big question is, like, what is the brand about, right? Like, if there's this one layer around the brand, and I call it the brand DNA. I'm sure there are other people who call brand DNA something else. I just call it brand DNA. It's really the idea of, if you went through all these exercises, if you created your positioning, if you figured out the personality, et cetera, how can you describe your brand in one word? And I think it's a crucial exercise for any business owner to do that, where if you think about Harley-Davidson and you would think about their brand DNA, it's one word, it's freedom, right? Like, that's Harley-Davidson stands for freedom. Zappos stands for service, right? It's all about customer service. You can go through every company. Coca-Cola is happiness. Everlane is transparency, et cetera, et cetera. And so I challenge everyone to actually do that. Like, what is a word that encapsulates your brand? And then if you have that, you can actually consistently base your communications around that, right? Like, why would you put something out there if it doesn't go back to your brand DNA word, right? So for me, I had to do the same exercise. So for Fabien, it's about clarity, right? So it's all about clarity. So whatever I put out there, I need to provide that value and create some kind of like before, after, and the after should be more clear, right? And so I challenge myself to do that all the time. And then I think, on the other hand, if you want to create consistent communications, the first thing you need to have is a strong brand image, right? Because otherwise you don't want to make that consistent, right? It has to be strong. And so look at your website, look at your website, remove the logo of the website, and then tell me that this is still uniquely your brand. Right? And I think if you say, oh, wait a minute, now it actually looks like a lot of other companies, and oops, without the logo, there's really not that much there. That's your opportunity to say, okay, so how can we create a unique visual and verbal language that even if you take the logo away, this is still us, right? And then you just take that personality, you take that brand DNA, and you take that new, serious brand image that you can own, and you start applying it to every single channel. I mean, your Twitter channel should look the same way as your website, right? Or your white paper. And we all get so carried away. We're like, oh yeah, we're just going to repost and post and do this and that. And I always say Instagram is the new website, right? Because we actually update Instagram, right? And this is very B2C, right? For many, it's LinkedIn, right? Or in the B2B world. But every single thing you should post, it should have the same look and feel. You should actually create it, right? Or it should have the same tone and voice, because in the end, that is you as a brand.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a perfect point. And one exercise, to Fabien's example is, I find it easy for our team to print out stuff. I know it sounds funny, but it's super practical, where you take your email and print it out, take a screenshot of your website, print it out, take your Instagram post, print it out, other advertising, print it out, and just put it on a wall. Either on a you scotch tape and put it on a whiteboard, or put it on a corkboard or something. There's something physical about being able to look at things at a complete mosaic. And so what we've done in the past is we've basically put up all the ads and or I shouldn't say ads, I should say communications, right? All the marketing communications. And, to Lars's earlier point about the customer journey, right? This is kind of what we say when folks are just aware of us. This is what we say when they're interested, or there may be a lead, or this is what we say when they're a customer. And this is what we say when they've been a customer for 2 years, right? And just put all that stuff up on a board, and visually you can see, is it consistent? Are we saying the same thing? To Fabien's point, is that single word carried through all of our touch points visually? And so that's just a helpful way to get a couple of pieces of foam core or your whiteboard and just tack that stuff up, and then have your whole team look at it, because I think you'd be surprised at the insight of some of your teammates that say, you know what, I don't think we're as consistent as we think we are. And so it's just a way to make sure that you're taking Fabien's advice of having the consistency.
Absolutely. And Lars, I know you've got some insight on this as well. And one thing I'd also like for you to chime in on is what sort of technology platforms should businesses be using to create and execute a unified brand?
I think brand consistency really comes through with the team, the company. I think Fabien, you mentioned before about the importance of the culture and how that drives the brand. And I think that carries through with consistency. When you have the team that's doing your social media posts buys into and understands the brand in the same way the person who's designing your email newsletters, the same person that's doing your website, that's answering the phones when somebody calls, your brand, we haven't really come up with a single word. We have our slogan and everything, but
you will, Lars, you will.
Yeah. Well, I believe it's partnership, and because in many ways we have to become partners with our customers for CRM to be effective, and that partnership runs through all the different aspects of a company's business. A CRM doesn't just touch one thing; the entire company is affected by the CRM, and so, for that to be effective, the whole company has to buy into the reason behind why you have a brand, the reason why you have a CRM, the reason why you design things the way that you do. If everyone's on the same page, and this is sort of an organizational kind of a human problem, or maybe not a problem, but a strategy. When everyone's on the same page, they see the importance of why being consistent across different brands affects the way people perceive your company. Right. And that's your brand voice. I mean, if everyone hears the same thing, and like we were talking about before, the messaging may be a little bit different and targeted towards different demographics, but the core of who you are, why are you in business? Why do you do the things that you do? That's the part that stays the same. And, in our case, the concept of being a partner with each of our customers is very important, so that everyone knows they get really good service as they come through. We provide a lot of written and video content to help them learn what they need to learn. And because a lot of partnership for us is around education. So because our whole team, and it's probably relatively easy for us because we're 22 people as opposed to a company with thousands and thousands of employees. But when everyone is part of that discussion and contributes to what that means, and especially when you're in a small and mid-sized space, it's easier to do this. But you have that collaborative environment inside your company that helps feel like it's collaborative with your customers and your leads. And I think that is what what builds the bridge between a company and its customers. And so, in a lot of ways, you want to have the technology that supports that whole discussion. If you're trying to use tons of different software pieces to maintain the same brand, it becomes a very complex animal to try and control. And that's the vision behind why we built GreenRope. Not to say there aren't other companies out there that have attempted to do similar things, but the reason why we have built this single platform with all the components built into it is to make it easier for everyone to get access to the information, to be able to communicate the brand consistently, and be able to measure how it's working consistently across the different channels and make sure it's actually effective.
Yeah, I love that. And me, as the marketing manager at GreenRope, I would definitely agree that a really good word is partnership. Definitely. We try to make as many resources, even in our social, to convey that. But I think that we do a pretty good job of exuding that. Well, guys, that was an incredibly insightful conversation. I'd like to open it up to the audience to ask some questions before we go, to maybe get some advice on how they can build their own brands. And so for everyone listening, if you'd like to ask a question, we do have a Q&A box. You're also welcome to put it in the webinar chat. We would love to have you just put in your questions, and you can ask them to all the panelists or to a single panelist, and we will make sure to get through all of them. We do have a couple here from Dan Volker. They are more GreenRope related, but perhaps we can also bring some insight in elsewhere. So Dan first asked, do we have a GreenRope technique to analyze Facebook post ads that are strategically created to work collaboratively with our GreenRope email campaigns? A synergistic campaign like this might cover some specific interests we know our subgroups have, and the Facebook component posts could be a bigger story and fit well into the news function to desire to browse that is typical of Facebook sessions for our contacts. Let's start there.
I think if we kind of generalize this into understanding social media and how that plays into our brand and segmenting into groups and everything, I think that's where this can be a really helpful discussion for people. I'm curious what Chris and Fabien, what you guys think about it. We try to, obviously there's a lot of limitations about what data you can get out of social media these days. They've locked down their APIs. It's hard to pull a lot of data out, and it's hard to get a lot of data in. But there's still a lot we can learn from social. And so we try to pull that data in as best we can. But a lot of times we have to use third-party tools like Hootsuite or Buffer to be able to pull that data out. What do you guys recommend?
Well, I personally think that with social, in a way, it's really easy. There are not that many tools, but you can just analyze it yourself so easily, right? It's like you will always be surprised by which posts do really well, right? It catches all of us where suddenly we're like, why is this one post blowing up and the other one that I spent 2 hours crafting, like no one cares about, right? But I think there's a lot of data there. There's a lot of insights of like who your audience actually is and what resonates with them. And there's a lot that can be done. And I want to circle back really quick to something, Chris, that you said about printing out all of your communications. And it's a little bit of tie-in into social. I think that one brand piece that most people see, most of us don't care much about when we create it, and it's emails, right? It's amazing, like especially like e-marketing, e-blasts, like quick announcements. If you go through your company and you go through like how many emails did we actually send our customers in the last, like 6 months? They all come from like disparate, sometimes desperate, but disparate, places within the company, the events people, the marketing folks, new business, whatever. usually they look horrible, and usually they look completely disjointed, and usually they don't have a tone of voice that is a singularly like one brand tone of voice. And when you think about it, you spend like, you know, $30, $50, $60,000 on a big website redesign, and it's the biggest thing you do, and like it takes 2 years, right? When in reality, every day you send out an email to like 10, 20, 30, 50,000 people, and it just goes out like that, right? So that's really what people see. So I think that besides only analyzing that, like also thinking about what actually touches our customer the most, and maybe we should start looking at that first.
That's a great point. The only thing that I would add to Lars's comment is just to test, because you don't know. You don't know, until you put stuff out there. The nice thing about digital marketing these days, especially in Facebook, is the iterations you can have, and on AdWords, the iterations you can have, and it's really a question of your balance of how much do you test and what's the incrementality, right? Maybe 12 tests is too much. Maybe 2 tests isn't enough, right? There's some magic number for your business that you can apply, because you don't know, truly. And so the tools available, though, especially in a toolbox like GreenRope, where you can test the various messages you might have, or the deployments that you put in play, that's the only way you're going to find out.
Yeah, and I think, the being able to use puppies whenever you promote anything on social media will always
right.
Whenever you test.
Whenever you test, add puppies.
We're even trying it in the webinar, but it doesn't come through as well.
Yeah.
Believe me, Lars has brought in his puppy before, and I mean that was a hit.
Talk about a shameless self-promotion using my dog.
Exactly right.
That's when you reach the bottom of marketing. You're like, well, all right, if all this doesn't work, I've got a puppy for you.
Yeah.
Just pull up the puppy.
There you go.
I've also noticed that a lot. Oh, sorry.
I think one of the things you can do is when you do a lot of posting on social media, you want to think of it sometimes it's got a strategy of building your brand. Sometimes it has a strategy of creating more likes and shares, whatever.
Different goals, yeah.
But when you're trying to do this as a call to action to bring people to your website, you can set up different campaign IDs for the different types of things that you're sharing or posting on social media. And then once you have a campaign ID, you can track that once it gets into your CRM or your marketing platform. And I think that's where you're really going to be connecting the dots between your different social media channels and your CRM and what's actually working for your marketing. And you can do things like, if somebody came from LinkedIn, or maybe they're coming from a particular group or a subgroup within Facebook or whatever, then you assign a certain campaign ID to them. And based on that campaign ID, you can then have different things happen. So within GreenRope, of course, we have this journey tool that lets you kind of split different things happen depending on different things that you know about them. But you can say, if someone comes from this particular campaign ID, we're going to do this, as opposed to someone coming from a different campaign ID, then we're going to do this. And so being able to personalize that allows you the freedom to be able to segment your market, to see what's working and compare what works and what doesn't work based on these different types of messaging that you can be trying out with your social media.
Yeah. Next question is for Fabien. Can any word potentially be used to describe a brand in one word, or only certain kinds of words? And this is from Jeff Maxon in Eyesight.
In Eyesight. Well, look, Jeff. I think it could be any word, right? I mean, it should be a word that most probably is more on the emotional side. And the caveat is, I said, Zappos has service, but the way that Zappos does service is extremely emotional, right? Like pick up the phone at midnight, right? You need a pizza, we deliver it, right? So it should be a word that it should be all encompassing. It should kind of evoke the product, while it also evokes the emotions that you want people to feel, right? So yeah, I mean, it could really be anything, right? It could even be an actionable verb if you think that that's right for your company. Absolutely.
And our next question, and I think this will be our final question before we have you guys give your last thoughts on the topic. Dan Day asked, does mascotting work in direct e-marketing? Your thoughts. The puppy comment made me think of that. and not for anyone in particular. So feel free to, whoever wants to take this one.
Right. I think that it just, it's a terrible answer, but it depends, and it depends on you, right? There are certain brands where the mascots have been very helpful, and where it's an immediate recognition, and it closes the gap, that brand awareness to interest, right? Immediately I see, though it's an older brand, it dates me a little bit, but everybody knew the mascot of the Michelin, at least for me growing up. The Michelin Man, if you guys don't remember, he's big and tubby, he's white, and talks about the Michelin tires and the stuff. And of that, if I ever saw a message with that kind of mascot, even if it's e-marketing, I immediately recognize who it's from, and I've got a brand connection and brand affinity. But it depends on your business if that's an effective way in which you think that your customers are going to really connect with you. Fabien, do you have any experience with that?
My relationship with brand mascots is a difficult one. It gets, it's very.
I don't mean to pry. I'm sorry.
Thanks for putting me on the spot. I guess I'm on a webinar. That's what happens. No, look, I personally actually like certain mascots, like the Michelin Man, things like that. Like you mentioned, it's great, but for most brands, I just don't feel it's very now. It just feels like it's a little dated. It's like, and if you drive through Central Europe and you see all these gas stations and they've got their little mascot, and you're like, well, that's not necessarily a brand, right? It's just like they're using a mascot to lure in the kids to get, like the candy, right? That's really it. But I feel to create a mascot that is super strong on the brand level is super, super difficult. But then to do it on a sub level is easy, right? So we talk about artificial intelligence, right? Iris, like Erica on Bank of America, et cetera, et cetera. Like actually creating that is something that would be, that I would actually advise doing, right? So you can have a mascot on a product or service level, but not at a brand level.
Interesting. And we are coming up quickly to the end of the hour. And so, again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. And I'd also like to thank the audience for listening in. I hope that you got as much out of this today as I did. It was very interesting. And it always, every time we do these types of panels, it always gets me thinking about our own branding at GreenRope and our own marketing and how we can get creative and really hone in on, our specific keywords and our marketing and the data that we use and all of that. So I'd like to thank you just, for myself as well. I surely learned a lot. But before I go, I'd really love if each one of you would just kind of give one piece of actionable advice for our listeners today of what they can take home with them today and inspire them to get started with really looking at their own brand. And Fabien, why don't we start with you?
Well, if I would say if you don't have heart and soul infused into your venture, you will always be a product or service offering and never a brand, right? So I think that even though it sounds esoteric, if you go through these exercises, you come out on the other side as a much, much more relatable and stronger brand that people actually will care about rather than just purchase products or services from.
Chris.
I would Google, if you haven't already, go to YouTube and Google Simon Sinek, Start with the Why. It's about 18 minutes. It's perfect. It really lays a foundational kind of idea of all the things that Fabien and Lars and I have spoken about. The other thing to do is to ask your team to describe your brand, and if your brand walked into a room, what would he or she look like? And just full-on descriptions, and let people just do it by themselves, put them up on a board and see if they have different ideas, and then come up with that one person.
That's great. And just for all of you who attended today, in this deck I'm going to be sending, I do have a link to that video. So you'll be getting that in your inbox here shortly. And last but certainly not least, Lars, what is your key takeaway for today?
I mean, that is a great video, but I think one of the things that we all have to do as business owners and managers is to take that step back and make sure we're working on our business and think about strategically, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? And are we using the tools to effectively communicate the brand? You know, what Fabien brought up earlier about, you know, people neglecting the design of their email after they've spent all this time on their websites is a perfect example. It happens all the time, where they didn't take that step back and think about, well, what are all these different touch points that we have, and are we being consistent all the way through? Does everyone in the company buy into the brand? Are they part of the team? And if they're not, why not? So it's a lot of it is it's taking that step back and thinking strategically, and it's not always a technology related problem. A lot of it's a human thing. What kind of a culture have you built? What sort of a message are you sending? And so that's where, as leaders in our businesses, whether you're the owner or you manage a department or whatever, at any stage of wherever you are in a business, you impact the brand. And if you take that step back and think about, how are you impacting that brand? Is it positive? Is it effective? Are you creating a team-based environment inside your organization where everyone feels like they're contributing to that brand? Then you're on the right path. And if you see places where that's not happening, take the steps to shore that up.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I know, again, I mean, I might be biased, but I think, you know, our CEO, Lars, has done a really great job of that at GreenRope. So
You're just saying that because I pay you.
I mean, but I've also been with the company for like 9 years now, so there's something to be said for that too, right?
That's true.
Again, you know, I'm almost even sad that this is over. This has been such a great panel. Thank you again so much for taking the time out of your busy day to join us here today. I really appreciate everything that you guys, all the knowledge you have instilled upon us. And again, thank you to all of our listeners. You will be getting this deck. You will also be getting the recording. So if you want to watch all of this again, and again, in this deck, there's some really great resources. And if you are a GreenRope user, or even if you're not, please check out our upcoming webinars. We've got some interesting ones, both about GreenRope platform, as well as some other strategy-based webinars coming up as well. So please look out for those. And again, thank you so much, guys. Have a wonderful afternoon, and hopefully we'll all talk again soon.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.